Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Imagine for just a second that you are an early human walking through a really dense ancient forest. You're hungry and you're constantly scanning the ground for your next meal. Now, long before we had modern laboratories, before scientists could analyze chemical compounds, and way before any kind of medicine existed to cure an upset stomach or, something much worse, ancient humans faced this truly deadly problem. The forests were absolutely packed with mushrooms. I mean, they were everywhere. But figuring out what to actually do with them, that was one of the ultimate survival challenges. So today, we're going to break down exactly how our ancestors solved this ancient mushroom dilemma.
Which brings us to the big, fascinating question. How on earth did humans discover which mushrooms were safe to eat? There's this really popular kind of cartoonish myth out there. The idea that there was just this one single, incredibly brave caveman who would walk right up to a wild fungus, take a massive bite, and just hope for the best while his whole tribe watched. But as we're going to see, that is absolutely not what happened. The real answer wasn't about a single brave person at all. It was actually a deeply complex, incredibly slow process of observation, lived experience, and this vital knowledge being passed down through generations.
Because the sheer irony of the situation our ancestors were in is actually pretty terrifying. On one hand, you've got this incredibly nutritious food. Mushrooms can be packed with nutrients, making them a fantastic energy source for a foraging tribe. But on the other hand, right next to it in the dirt, you have deadly poison. Some of these mushrooms could kill a person after just a single meal. And the scary part? There was literally no guidebook to tell the difference. No app on your phone to scan it, no survival manual to flip through. A single meal could literally either save you from starving or it could kill you. And early humans had to figure out how to navigate this incredibly high-stakes environment entirely from scratch. To start figuring this out, early humans naturally turned to the world around them, which leads us to Section 1, Watching the Animals, the Flawed Clue. So early humans were master observers of the natural world, right? They watched everything. So their first logical step was just to look at the wildlife. They noticed which plants and mushrooms the animals eagerly ate, and they paid super close attention to the ones the animals completely avoided. Sounds like a pretty perfect system, right? Just copy the deer or the squirrels. But they very quickly learned a dark, dark lesson. Animals could sometimes safely eat mushrooms that were violently poisonous to humans, because animal bodies and human bodies process toxins entirely differently. Observation alone just wasn't enough. Watching the animals was a good start, for sure, but relying on it completely, that was a recipe for disaster. Because just watching animals failed them, they had to develop a totally new system. This brings us to Section 2, the slow taste test, ancient protocol. When these ancient tribes encountered unfamiliar foods, they didn't just toss them into the cooking pot. No way. They tested them with what we can only describe as extreme caution. They followed this grueling protocol. Step 1, a tiny, minuscule amount might be tasted first, just a nibble. Then comes Step 2, which is arguably the hardest part. They would wait. They would wait for hours or even a full day, carefully monitoring their own bodies to see if that tiny bite caused any sickness, cramps, or worse. If, after a full 24 hours, it seems safe, we move to Step 3. They might try just a little bit more the next time. I mean, just imagine the gravity of that process. Waiting a whole day, constantly wondering if you've just ingested a deadly toxin, all just to add one new item to the tribe's menu. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is this. Determining safe foods was not a quick experiment. It required a painfully slow, methodical process. You couldn't just map out the edible food of a forest in a single weekend. It took observation, direct experience, and a whole lot of time. Over many, many years, communities slowly, painstakingly built their collective knowledge about which mushrooms were a safe, reliable food source and which ones were dangerous traps. But, as you can imagine, that slow process came with a heavy cost. Let's look at Section 3, Lessons from Tragedy, Generational Data. This right here is where the survival of the human race truly takes shape across the generations. The dark reality of this whole trial and error method is that sometimes people did get seriously ill, some even died. But look at how humans responded to those first-generation tragedies. Those horrible experiences weren't just forgotten. They basically became powerful data points. By the second generation, parents were using those memories to explicitly teach their kids what to avoid. By the third generation, tribal elders were actively warning the younger hunters before they ever set foot in the forest. And across countless generations, this accumulated knowledge evolved into deep-rooted tradition. They transformed individual tragedies into a life-saving communal database. And as this database grew, the very culture of the tribe shifted. The safest mushrooms, the ones that survived those grueling taste tests and the test of time, they became trusted, celebrated staple foods. But the deadly ones, they were codified into the tribe's lore. They became the stories shared around the fire, the traditions, the stern warnings given to every single child. This is exactly how survival rules were written before pen and paper ever existed. Communities literally built a shield of stories to make sure they didn't make the same deadly mistakes twice. Through these stories and traditions, the physical attributes of the forest became categorized. That brings us to Section 4, Building a Survival Guide, the final checklist.
As human knowledge compounded over time, people figured out they didn't have to rely on the slow taste test anymore. Well, as long as they could perfectly identify what was right in front of them. They built a mental guidebook using this exact checklist. Shape, learning to identify the specific curve of a cap or the structure of a stem. Color, knowing the exact hue that meant safety versus danger. Smell, the earthy sense of a nutritious meal compared to the weird, acrid warning of a toxin. Where they grew, did it sprout on dead wood or in the soil? And the season they appeared, was it a spring bloom or an autumn harvest? By rapidly processing all of these physical traits and environmental clues, entire communities were finally able to recognize safe foods on site.
Now, you might be thinking, well, that was the ancient world. Surely we have this all totally sorted out by now. But let's bring this right back to today, because even now, experts constantly warn that many poisonous mushrooms closely resemble edible ones. I mean, the physical differences between a delicious meal and a trip to the emergency room can be incredibly subtle. That is exactly why identifying wild mushrooms still requires great knowledge, intense study, and extreme caution. The dangers of the ancient forest haven't magically disappeared. The mushrooms are exactly the same as they were thousands of years ago. So, what does this all mean? The story of mushrooms isn't just a story about food. It's a story about the pure resilience of early humans. It's about how our ancestors survived by intimately observing nature, learning from devastating, heartbreaking experiences, and fiercely passing that knowledge from one generation to the next. Because in the ancient world, the difference between dinner and disaster could literally be as small as picking the wrong mushroom. Which really leaves us with something to think about. What everyday safety do we just completely take for granted today that was paid for with the lives and the immense patience of our ancestors?